What if one of the most important skills in education is also one of the hardest to teach? Take a moment to reflect on these questions. Do my students know what it really means to think critically? Do they move beyond description and opinion into analysis, evidence, and evaluation? Do they feel confident questioning ideas, assumptions, and arguments? Do my teaching strategies give students practical tools to develop critical thinking, rather than simply telling them to be more critical? For many educators, the answer is complicated. Critical thinking is often described as essential. It appears in course handbooks, assessment criteria, marking rubrics, graduate attributes, and institutional strategies. At postgraduate level especially, students are expected to analyze, evaluate, challenge assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and construct reasoned arguments. But here is the problem. We often tell students to think critically without always showing them how. Students may be told that their work needs more analysis, or that they should be more critical, but these phrases can remain abstract. For some learners, critical thinking can sound like criticism. For others, it can feel like a mysterious academic skill that some students naturally have and others do not. Balin and colleagues argue that critical thinking is often misunderstood, sometimes reduced to finding faults rather than engaging in balanced, disciplined evaluation. Faccione defines critical thinking as purposeful, self-regulatory judgment, involving interpretation, analysis, evaluation, and inference. Ennis describes it as reasonable, reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or do. In simple terms, critical thinking is not about being negative. It is about asking better questions. It is about slowing thinking down. It is about examining what is being claimed, what evidence supports it, what assumptions sit beneath it, what alternative perspectives exist, and what consequences might follow. And this matters because we now live in a world of constant information, competing claims, misinformation, artificial intelligence, social media, political polarization, and rapidly changing workplaces. The ability to think critically is no longer just an academic skill. It is a life skill. Yet developing critical thinking is difficult. Students may experience cognitive overload when faced with complex ideas. They may lack the confidence to question others. They may not have the language needed to challenge ideas respectfully. They may also come from educational backgrounds where questioning the teacher, the text, or the accepted view was not encouraged. So the question becomes, how do we make critical thinking visible, teachable, and practical? One powerful answer comes from one of the oldest traditions in education, Socratic questioning. The Socratic method, rooted in the dialogues of Socrates, uses questioning to explore ideas, uncover assumptions, test reasoning, and move learners towards deeper understanding. Rather than giving students the answer, Socratic questioning helps students examine the quality of their own thinking. Paul and Elder describe critical thinking as the art of analyzing and evaluating thinking with a view to improving it. Socratic questioning gives us a practical route into that process. It asks questions such as, what do you mean by that? What evidence supports this? What are you assuming? Is there another way of looking at this? What might follow if this were true? Can you think of a counterexample? These questions may seem simple, but when used well, they can transform the quality of classroom dialogue. They move students beyond, I agree, or, I disagree, into deeper reasoning. They encourage learners to justify, clarify, challenge, and reconsider. They help students move from surface understanding towards analysis, evaluation, and synthesis, the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. However, Socratic questioning also presents a challenge. If students are simply asked to generate sophisticated questions on the spot, many may struggle. Some may freeze. Some may rely on familiar patterns of discussion. Some may avoid contributing altogether. This is where scaffolding becomes essential. Vygotsky's work reminds us that learners often develop best when support is provided within the zone between what they can do independently and what they can do with guidance. Sweller's cognitive load theory also reminds us that learning can be blocked when students are overwhelmed by too much complexity at once. So, if we want students to ask better questions, we need to give them tools that make questioning easier to practice. That was the thinking behind the Academy-inspired question cards. The question cards were designed by Dr. Joe Toko as a practical way to support critical thinking, discussion, and deeper learning. They take the abstract idea of Socratic questioning and turn it into a visible, usable classroom resource. The cards are built around 7 types of Socratic question. First, clarifying concepts. These questions help students define ideas more clearly. For example, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that in another way? What is the key concept here? Second, probing assumptions. These questions help students uncover what is being taken for granted. What are you assuming? Why might someone accept this as true? What belief sits behind this argument? Third, seeking evidence and reasons. These questions move students away from unsupported opinion. What evidence supports this? How do we know this is reliable? What reasons are being offered? Fourth, exploring implications and consequences. These questions help students think beyond the immediate claim. What might happen if this is true? What are the possible consequences? Who might be affected by this? Fifth, questioning viewpoints and perspectives. These questions widen the discussion. How might someone else see this? Whose voice is missing? What alternative explanation could there be? Sixth, probing origins and sources. These questions encourage students to examine where ideas come from. Where did this idea originate? Who produced this evidence? What context shaped this claim? Seventh, challenging with counterexamples. These questions test the strength of an argument. Can you think of an example where this would not apply? What exception might challenge this claim? Does this argument work in every context? Together, these 7 types of questions help students practice the habits of critical thinking. But the real value of the cards is that they make critical thinking active. Students are not just listening to a tutor explain critical thinking. They are using the cards to do critical thinking. In a seminar, students might draw a card and use it to respond to a reading. In a debate, each group might be assigned a different type of question. In peer feedback, students might use the cards to challenge and strengthen each other's arguments. In reflective writing, students might use 3 cards as prompts to deepen their analysis. In staff development, colleagues might use the cards to examine assumptions behind curriculum design, assessment, leadership, or decision-making. The cards work because they reduce the cognitive load of questioning. Students do not have to invent the perfect critical question from nothing. The prompt gives them a starting point. They also support inclusion. Quieter students, less confident students, and students unfamiliar with critical discussion are given a structure that helps them participate. They make discussion more purposeful. Instead of conversation drifting into general opinion, the cards guide students towards evidence, assumptions, implications, perspectives, and reasoning. Over time, the aim is for students to internalize these questions. At first, the card asks the question. Later, the student begins to ask it for themselves. That is the deeper purpose of the resource. Not dependency, development. Of course, like any educational tool, the cards need to be used carefully. They should not become a rigid checklist. Critical thinking is not a formula. Rich discussion still needs flexibility, responsiveness, and skilled facilitation. If used mechanically, the cards may produce surface-level questioning rather than genuine inquiry. But if used thoughtfully, they can act as a bridge between uncertainty and confidence. They help students move from not knowing how to be critical, to practicing criticality, to eventually thinking critically with greater independence. This is important because critical thinking cannot be developed through one lecture, one worksheet, or one assessment comment. It has to be practiced repeatedly, socially, dialogically, across different contexts. The question cards create opportunities for that practice. They remind us that critical thinking is not simply something students either have or do not have. It is something we can teach, something we can model, something we can scaffold, something we can practice together. So perhaps the question is not simply, are students thinking critically? Perhaps the better question is, what are we doing to help them learn how? Because when students learn to ask better questions, they begin to produce better thinking. And when they produce better thinking, they become more confident learners, stronger writers, more thoughtful professionals, and more engaged citizens. The Academy-inspired question cards are a simple tool with a powerful purpose: to make critical thinking visible, to make questioning accessible, and to help learners move from passive acceptance to active inquiry. Because education is not just about giving students answers. It is about helping them develop the courage, confidence, and skill to ask better questions.